7 grams, alone in a cabin. A mushroom trip report sent in by a subscriber. I'm pretty experienced in psychedelics, having over a decade of trip experience. I had other heavy trips before, including a 7-gram mushroom trip, which was my second ever experience, and dropping 20 tabs of acid in one sitting, both in silent darkness. My 7-gram trip was during my senior year of high school on a Thursday. I don't remember the exact day, but it was during spring. While having those trips did prepare me for some of the craziest stuff, nothing could have prepared me for the suffering I felt with this one. This trip was the most intense experience to date. Listening to Terence McKenna was what initially got me into psychedelics, and I do like his high-dose, infrequent trips approach. After my 7-gram trip, it was always a life goal of mine to do another high-dose mushroom trip, but completely alone in a cabin in the woods. Some years after the initial 7-gram trip, I would trip pretty consistently, at least once a month for about 2 years, but on lower doses. I used it as a crutch because every time I had to make a major life decision, I would rely on the knowledge I would get from the trips. In one of my later experiences, the mushrooms told me I won't be given access back to that realm until I get my life in order by myself. There were a couple of requirements I would need to have passed, and until I did, I wouldn't be able to go back. I even tried taking mushrooms a couple times after that, and while I did feel the effects of the drug, the warm magic of the mushrooms was nowhere to be found. So it's been 5 years since my last trip, and over 10 years since my 7-gram trip, and I was content waiting with no rush or desire to go back there. However, there was a problem. Ultimately, I knew that regardless of what path I took in life, all paths would end up in the same place, and that place was taking 7 grams of mushrooms alone in a cabin in the woods during silent darkness. To those that have taken mushrooms before, you know that it calls to you. Something just draws your soul towards it. To those that haven't, the best way I could describe it is it just starts as a simple thought out of the blue. It's been a while since I've done mushrooms, now might be the perfect time. Then that thought goes away for a while, until it comes back a little bit stronger. Then, both the frequency and the intensity of that thought increases until it's resonating in your brain, an echo that can only be let out once you've had your trip. For many years, I didn't get the calling and wasn't even planning it, but I felt as if I was just summoned. The calling. As I mentioned, I knew at one point of my future that I would need to do this cabin in the woods trip. It was just something engraved in me. But the thing about taking a high-dose psychedelic trip is that it can be absolutely terrifying. I've had some pretty dangerous, near-death experiences in my life, but nothing compared to the absolute dread and terror I felt in my first 7-gram trip. Thinking about it used to send shivers across my entire body, but I knew I had to go back. That future trip was haunting me for 10 years, and I would think to myself, is this year the year? Then one day, December 13th, I was just talking to one of my friends about psychedelics, and I got the calling. This time, it didn't come as a thought, but it felt like I was being summoned. I wanted to take time off work and go away the next day, that's how bad the urge was. I just knew it was time. I booked the cabin for Christmas weekend and started preparing. When I first realised I had to go back, I was absolutely terrified. Suddenly I began getting flashbacks from the first trip, things that I'd repressed. Every day I thought about it. I became more and more terrified, but then something within me switched during the last couple of days, and I was no longer afraid. I accepted my faith, and it felt like I was just in autopilot. I was no longer scared, and I just knew that on Friday night, I would be consuming the mushrooms as if it's something that's already been written into my future. When that time came, I would be there, and it's something that was outside of my control. The journey. After booking the cabin and gathering the mushrooms, I found out that we were getting hit with one of the worst storms we were ever having in 2 decades. The United States had a very horrible storm the day before Christmas. It also happened to be a new moon that night. When I found out, I thought to myself, perfect, the set is being staged. Worst storm in decades, during a new moon, on one of the holiest days of the year, in a cabin in the woods. Surely the set is staged for magic to happen that night. I wanted the journey to be intense. I felt like I was a knight on my horse going to face the dragon. Friday comes around and I have everything gathered as I'm ready to begin my journey. I finish work at 5 and start heading there around 6. Then I started driving there. It got dark quick and very cold. When I started the trip it was 30 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time I got there it was 8. The wind was so intense that going above 60 miles per hour would start shaking the car. But I was not afraid no longer. I was calm. I was the knight on the horse going to the lair of the dragon. the closer I got, the calmer I became. All the fear that I had was being evaporated. I knew that I was going to embrace my destiny. The trip. Once I get to the cabin, I smoke weed and just think about my life and my friends, my family, all the good moments in life. I begin crushing the mushrooms by hand and apologise to every single one of them. I'm sorry, I love you, you know. I realise that the dragon in the analogy is not the mushroom trip, as that's not what I needed to fight. The dragon is the fear of the mushroom trip. Then, I soak it in lemonade with freshly squeezed lemons. After crushing the mushrooms by hand, I begin rolling up my weed for the trip. I end up drinking the potion at midnight after the mushrooms have soaked for about 30 minutes. Put my phone on airplane mode to not be disturbed. After I gulp it down, I think to myself, is that it? Is this what I've been afraid of for 10 years? Within 5 minutes of consumption, I get an immense feeling of self-love. It was a very powerful feeling, almost over-exaggerated. It felt like my soul was the perfect match for my body or identity, and I was very happy to be there. Then, I sit down on a couch and wait for the effects. I try and wait until I start feeling something before smoking, to smooth out the come up. I knew I took a big dose, and people report effects already within the first 20 minutes. I keep waiting, but nothing crazy starts happening. So, I wait until 12:25 and I go out to smoke a blunt. I come back in and suddenly get very lethargic. At this time it's around 12:40 and I think to myself, now might be a good time to go lie down and close your eyes. So I head to the room I'm going to be tripping in, and it's very dark in there, no music. It's begun. It starts off with a beautiful show, with all the complex psychedelic patterns you see in the Alex Grey paintings. So far the come-up is going beautifully. The mushrooms told me that love is the answer. People like to go into high-dose mushroom trips with a question or a certain purpose. What I found personally is that the question gets answered in the first couple minutes, and the rest of the trip is just about survival. Then, I start feeling what can be described as invisible mushroom fairies. I couldn't really see them, but there were millions of them. They were very small, and what I imagine is circular shape. As soon as the fairies see me, they start celebrating and in a high-pitched voice saying, "Yay, M's back, welcome back." It felt like they were very happy to see me, and I was happy to see them. I was laying down with my eyes closed and opened my arms as if I was going for a hug. All the mushroom fairies went in for the hug, and I kept telling them that I loved them. It felt like seeing an old friend after a long time. Then, they took my hand and started to lead me through the mushroom dimension. The geometric psychedelic patterns had begun to turn into a video game-like place. I saw the robot boxing game where the red figure knocks out the blue one, and that image got duplicated infinite number of times. At the end of each game, the fairies were cheering in a high-pitched voice. They carried me through their land and showed me different games like that. Each area was a moment of a game that got repeated infinite times, and when that moment came, all the fairies cheered. There were separate games I went to, but the boxing one is the only one I remember clearly. It did feel like I was in a circus inside a video game. Not sure if this is due to my heavy gamer background or the realm is starting to transform to reflect a more modern time. I also heard the Mario noise sound going infinitely, like at a very fast, consistent pace. So far, the come up has been pleasant and the trip has been beautiful so far. Then, I get the urge to check the time, to measure how far into the trip I am just to see how well I'm doing. I'm wearing an analog watch that doesn't light up and look at it. Absolute darkness, so I can't tell the time. I then try to stand up and walk to the light to see the time, but realise I barely have any balance. Then, I start crawling into the hallway to try and catch some light. I look at my watch. 1:15. Not bad, I think to myself. So far I'm doing pretty good. So then, I crawl back into bed and close my eyes. This time when I go back, the fairies went away and I started seeing entities. I notice every time I close my eyes to dive back in, I begin to see dark entities which try to scare me. But I said out loud, "You can't scare me, I love you." And then I was able to rise up to a higher place. This kept happening for a while, and then I started seeing this dark seductress. She was absolutely massive. It's hard to properly scale the mushroom dimension, but imagine looking up and just seeing this massive creature taking up the whole sky. She was dressed all in black, with long flowing black hair as well. She also had a black witch hat which was covering her eyes. I knew she was looking at me, even though her eyes were covered because her head was tilted towards my direction. I kept resisting her presence because something inherently told me that she was evil and I should keep resisting her. I was still feeling pretty good at that point, and I got the urge to record the trip for future psychedelic explorers. feeling as if I've made a major discovery that I need to bring back to this earth. I thought to myself, I need to capture all this while I still remember it. This was at the 1 hour 40 minute mark, or 1:40 AM. It was very difficult to talk normally. I would start talking about the trip, and then have thought pattern loops which would distract me. The first thing mentioned in the recording was the humming noise. The Mario coin sound from the beginning of my trip began speeding up and becoming more uniform, almost as if it turned into a frequency, very similar to a humming sound. In the recording, I addressed it as the fucking humming of the universe. Around this time is when I started feeling horrible. I became very nauseous, and the trip was getting more intense by the minute, and I was just barely holding on. I kept saying, I'm resisting. I felt like I was losing my mind. I said to myself, I feel like I'm losing my mind, and it's fucking marvellous. And then started dancing and singing for a couple of minutes. At this point, the only thing I could do was to keep focusing on my breath. I felt like I was barely keeping track of reality, and I said, I guess this is it then. I knew reality was about to break. That is when I decided to fall back into the trip and went to lie back down. This is when the real trip began. Next time I went back, the dark seductress went away. I saw death for a brief moment. It was like a dark cloud, an independent entity wrapped up in its own darkness. I thought to myself, is that the purpose of this trip? To face the fear of death? The death entity was moving slowly across my vision, and then just stopped in front of me. It took a moment to look at me, inspect me, and then decided to wander off. When it turned away from me, it slowly started moving away, then I felt like I got transported somewhere else. Maybe it'll come back later to deal with me further in the trip, I thought to myself. It didn't. The next thing I saw was a Baphomet-looking entity coming at me with the fingers up, fingers down pose. I knew I was going to some dark places now. From here on, it just kept getting darker and darker for the next 2 hours. It's hard to keep track of the order of things. After making the recording, I drank some water and went to lie back down in the darkness, but the recording was still going. Things started getting more intense, and I became very uncomfortable. Every minute felt like eternity, and I was barely holding on to reality. At this point, I've already begun to let go of my identity, of my past, my future, myself. Nothing else mattered, except that current moment. I was there in the cabin at night, completely alone, and nobody was coming to help. I didn't even want the help, to be honest. I knew that the suffering I was going through at that moment was meant to be. There was no escape from this uncomfortable feeling. No kind words would have helped at all, nor the best medical treatment in the world. I tried to just lie down in the bed and breathe, but the mushroom energy was too strong. The closed-eye visuals were no longer something I saw, but something that was moving through my consciousness. I tried to rise myself from a dark place by using the Om noise, but it didn't help. The mushrooms were too strong. The energy in the bed was too intense. It just kept ripping through me, erasing parts of myself. So I got out trying to change the course of the trip. I could barely even walk and started crawling around the room. I tried to do anything I could to distract myself from the immense suffering I was feeling. I was just laying on the floor with my eyes closed, begging God for mercy, trying to remember even the most basic prayers. No matter what I did though, there was just no escape. It was an unbearable feeling of reality being torn apart. Around here is when my identity was really losing its meaning. Even though I was able to remain conscious, nothing else was real. Other people weren't real, other time frames weren't real. The only real thing was that room and my insanity. I was on the floor just trying to continue breathing. I was twisting and jerking around, lying on the floor begging for mercy, doing different poses. Being in the child pose really helped a lot. It seemed the perfect pose to assume while going through the suffering and was just something that I went to naturally. I was lying on the floor for about 30 minutes just mumbling incoherently. Then 46 minutes into the recording, or at 2:26 AM, I began talking again. So, what I learned about life in this trip: you gotta show up every day, and that's what matters. Everyday actions determine what happens to people. Willpower plus daily activity equals the life you want. And this is when it started happening. My separation from this world. I had this feeling come across me like we're all actors and this world isn't real. This whole world is a lie, just a temporary plane for us to live in. That is when I felt the pain of all the animals that froze to death that night. I felt their suffering. Even though I was going through this immense suffering, I was still blessed to be alive. Every moment of each life is precious and full of meaning. Then, my mind shifted to Anthony Bourdain and how he committed suicide. That's when I thought to myself, even suicide wouldn't save me from this. This existence is immortal. Even if I'm no longer attached to this body, My existence will continue. There was really nothing I could do to escape this moment. This is when I realised how alone I actually was, in the middle of nowhere, going through one of the hardest times of my life. However, I was happy that nobody else was coming. As Terence always said, "Go at it alone." I'm glad I didn't have a trip sitter, because if they saw what I was going through, they might have called for help and ended the trip prematurely. Even if there were 100 people there, not a single person would be able to help me right now. What I was going through was meant for me to go through, and just for me. The nausea kept growing worse until I just started throwing up at 2:38. I felt much better after I threw up. It became much easier to breathe. There wasn't any fear around it or hesitation like there is normally. I just puked and let it all out. After that it became a little bit more manageable, but I still had to focus on my breath to stop reality from fully ripping apart. Most of my identity was already chipped away, and my past was irrelevant, and I couldn't even remember a single moment from my life. Who my friends or family were didn't matter, as I couldn't remember them at all. Even the world didn't seem real. We're all just a bunch of actors for the greatest show. I was in that room holding on to the edge of reality. After resisting for quite a while, I reached an epiphany. My insanity was the last thing holding reality together. That was the secret to the mushroom trip. You need to ascend through your insanity. I felt immense joy when I realised this, because for the first time during the trip there was a way out, a possible relief. I already let go of everything else, and for my insanity to end, I needed to let go of reality entirely. It might seem like insanity would be easy, but it was the hardest thing to let go of because it was the only thing keeping me in this world. My ego would rather suffer insanity than to cease existing. I struggled with this realisation for a couple of minutes before I made my final decision. I already let go of everything else, and this was the final step before I could be free from the suffering of my existence. I didn't know if I was going to come back or where I would be going to, but I no longer cared. I just couldn't stay where I was. So, with my decision made, I went back to the bed, into the silent darkness, and said out loud, "Goodbye world, I'll be back in a couple hours." I didn't go to another realm like I thought, but instead, I lived moments of other people's lives. One of my reincarnations was a moment in this overweight Latino boy's life, around 10 to 12 years old, and he'd just won a football game. Then, I shifted to a battlefield, thinking about the wars going on in the world. I was then a person who was just shot to death in the war, an innocent bystander just getting mowed down. I remember it felt like there were 4 or 5 bullets being shot through me. Then, for one of my forms, I was born as a deformed baby just going into this world. That one didn't last very long. I remember having a very deformed skull and crying, and then I left that form onto the other one. After that, I was a dog being beaten by its owner. The last form I remember clearly was a black slave during colonial American times getting whipped on my back. At this part of the trip, I just felt the suffering of different beings. Whilst it was very unpleasant, I was no longer me, no longer insane, just a consciousness, existing free of identity. While that was happening in my head, in the real world I kept making a swimming motion with my arm, and I physically changed my location within the mushroom realm. It felt like my head was getting squeezed, as if I was going through the womb into this world. I was in the place where people get reborn, like the womb of the universe. My head was getting squeezed as I was being reborn, and then I popped out. And then came the moment where my soul was fully free from my body. I remember I kept seeing the coat and shoes on a hanger, like when someone takes them off when they enter the house. My soul was just bare, alone in the realm without me. I was just me. Not the me in this world with my body, but the immortal me that's existed before this world and will exist after it. I'm pretty sure I was in the spirit realm at this point, completely unbound. I even might have seen God, the ultimate God, but I don't remember much of this part. It was just a very bright, warm feeling, and it had a very ultimate sense to it. The light was so bright I couldn't even see the full figure. I gained conscious again when I opened my eyes, and I went straight for my phone to check the time. I reach down, turn over the phone, and see the time. 6:22 AM. I think to myself, I survived. Update and closing thoughts. It's been 2 weeks since the trip, and I needed to get this out to process it. I didn't feel like my life really changes too much since the trip. It does feel like something shifted inside of me, but at the same time, I feel exactly the same. I think I'm past the stage where psychedelic trips will just give me an automatic power boost. For me to get the full effects of this trip, I would need to unpack and incorporate it while sober. Writing out this trip report was the first step of unpacking. One thing that I did notice is I don't really think of my life before this trip. I know I had one, and I have the memories, but it doesn't really matter anymore. It's like the last chapter finished and a new chapter began, free of the burdens of the past, free to plan out a future where I can decide what way to go. This trip mainly humbled me by showing the suffering of others around me. The two things I took away from this trip is the suffering of others and the feeling that this world is fake and we are just actors. During the end of the trip, it was a feeling I knew to be true, but now it's just a faint memory. As of now, I don't have any trips coming up, but I'm not opposed to the idea of going back. The fear that haunted me for 10 years is now gone. I'm no longer scared of that realm. While this trip was the most suffering I ever felt, I'm not bitter about it, but actually grateful. I've never been so happy to just be me in my own life, a feeling that many of us take for granted. Safe travels, everyone.